Nearly 30 years ago, on a damp, cold autumn evening in Middlesbrough, a young woman left her workplace as usual and vanished without a trace, leaving her family in confusion and unanswered questions. The authorities quickly concluded that this was a case of an adult missing person with no immediate danger, no body, no crime scene, and very few leads to pursue further. Time passed, the file was closed, and life went on, but her absence never stopped haunting those left behind. However, through all those years, small details once dismissed as inconsistent lay quietly in the file, waiting for someone patient enough to re-examine everything from the beginning. And then, many years later, just one change in the way questions were asked opened up a chain of unexpected discoveries, powerful enough to shake the entire story that everyone thought they had understood long ago. Before diving deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the latest cases. Middlesbrough, an autumn evening in 1994, the industrial city on the River Tees, shrouded in the familiar atmosphere of damp chill and pale yellow streetlights, reflecting on the rain-wet road, as the rhythm of the day shift faded and the night shift quietly took over. Laura Bennett left her workplace as usual, unhurried, without hesitation, a young figure blending into the sparse crowd, leaving the town center. She pulled her coat zipper up a little higher, by reflex from evenings accustomed to the northern wind, stepped down the front steps, her shoes lightly touching the damp stone, then continued forward, where rows of houses, bus stops, and industrial roads stretched under the hazy streetlights. There was nothing unusual in that moment. No argument, no footsteps following, no panicked glance back. Laura walked as she had on hundreds of evenings before, a young woman returning home after work, carrying everyday thoughts that no one around could guess. The last moment anyone saw her was an image so ordinary, it was unmemorable. Laura walking through the familiar space of Middlesbrough, where the industrial streets had seen countless people pass by and disappear from sight, leaving no trace beyond the feeling that they had once been there. Then night fell completely. The city sank deeper into the quiet of the late shift, when shops closed, buses thinned out, and residential areas began to drift into sleep. In one house, the living room light remained on. Time passed slowly and uncomfortably. The familiar chair where Laura usually sat remained empty, silent, like an out-of-sync detail in the room. No sound of keys in the lock, no door opening, no familiar footsteps on the floor. At first, the waiting was just a vague feeling, easily dismissed with simple assumptions. Maybe she stopped somewhere, maybe she was later than usual. But as the clock kept ticking, the silence began to carry a different weight. The phone was picked up, then put down, a call unanswered, then another. Familiar names were called, short questions repeated, but no one knew where Laura was. As the night grew deeper, the house became emptier, and unease gradually seeped into every pause between calls. Middlesbrough, outside, still stood with its yellow lights, rain-wet roads, and silent industrial areas, but Laura did not return. Finally, when all simple assumptions were exhausted, when there were no more places to call, and no explanation that sounded reasonable, the family was forced to face what no one wanted to think about. Laura had vanished. In the exhaustion and confusion of the late night, they called the police, not with certainty that something terrible had happened, but with a chilling fear that an evening thought to be ordinary had ended with an irreplaceable void. Cleveland police received the family's missing person report for Laura Bennett late into the night, at a time when most of Middlesbrough was deep in the sleep following the end of the day shift. At the station desk, the case was immediately passed to the night shift investigator, tasked with assessing the urgency and deciding the first steps according to procedure. There was no information about violence, no prior threats, no signs that Laura was in immediate danger. On the desk, a new file was opened in her name, marked as a missing person file, a familiar, almost routine procedure, but also the moment when Laura's disappearance officially became a legal matter. The investigator began systematically collecting initial data, following the few traces left from the previous night. The place Laura left was recorded first, her workplace in central Middlesbrough, where she finished her evening shift as usual. No reports of conflict, no incidents at work, No one remembered anything unusual in the final minutes Laura was there. From this starting point, the investigator moved to the expected route, the path that Laura, according to habit and family accounts, usually walked or traveled to get home. On the city map, familiar routes were marked, lit streets, intersections, paths used by hundreds daily. This was not a secret or dangerous route. It was considered normal, a factor that would later carry far greater significance than the investigators could recognize on that first night. The next question was who last saw Laura. Names of a few witnesses appeared in the initial file: colleagues, passers-by, a fleeting glance sufficient to confirm Laura had left work and stepped onto the street. These statements were carefully recorded, but at this stage, they only served to confirm her final presence in public space, without raising any suspicions. The investigator continued with the familiar procedural sequence, trying to establish the three foundational points for every missing person case: last seen, last known direction, and last contact. Last seen was established near where Laura left, an ordinary image with no signs of fear or coercion. Last known direction was inferred from the familiar route she usually took, a reasonable assumption, without contradictory information. Last contact, the final point in this chain, was a notable gap: no calls, no messages, no one heard Laura say she would change plans or go elsewhere. These 3 points, placed together, formed a picture that seemed clear. An adult woman left work, followed her usual route, and did not return home. No clear signs of crime, no scene, no direct witnesses to an incident. Based on what they had, the investigator officially classified the case: missing adult, no immediate risk. This was a decision correct by regulations, reflecting the reality that most adult missing persons cases end with them returning voluntarily, or being found safe. But this decision was not just a line in the file, it was a strategic choice, shaping how the case would be handled in the hours, days, and even years ahead. With this classification, the case priority was set at medium level. No immediate emergency forces were mobilized. No area lockdown, no assumption that a serious crime had occurred. Instead, the file was built step by step, based on the assumption that Laura might have changed plans voluntarily, might be late, or might be out of contact somewhere that night. In the quiet atmosphere of the police station, as the first pages of the missing person file were completed, no one could know that this initial classification decision would become the foundation for a series of subsequent choices made with full reason at the time, but later scrutinized in every detail. The first night ended with a file opened, a chain of points established, and a foundational assumption that no immediate danger threatened Laura Bennett. That was how the case began, quietly and reasonably, in a city accustomed to everything continuing as normal, even when someone did not return home. Immediately after the missing person file for Laura Bennett was opened and classified according to procedure, the next procedural step followed almost instantly, constructing a minute-by-minute timeline for the night she vanished. For Cleveland police investigators, this was the foundation of the entire investigation, because in a missing person case, without a clear scene, time was the only thing that could be measured, controlled, and verified. They started from the most certain point the file could provide: the moment Laura left work. Colleagues confirmed her evening shift ended as usual, neither later nor earlier, with no event disrupting her schedule. From that moment, every minute after Laura stepped out of the familiar workplace space was dissected, with the goal of filling the gap between left and did not return home. The investigators spread out to the area identified as last seen, where Laura was last seen in public space. Witness statements were collected systematically, not only from those who directly said they saw Laura, but also from those present in the area at the same time. Questions were repeated with seemingly trivial details: who they saw, where, what the lighting was like, did Laura walk or stop, was anyone with her. Each statement was carefully recorded, because at this stage, the investigators could not know which piece of information would become important. However, right in the first hours, one issue began to emerge clearly: the witnesses did not agree with each other on the time they saw Laura. The first witness, a familiar face in the area, stated that they saw Laura leave the building where she worked and step onto the street while there were still quite a few people around. According to their estimate, That time fell at the beginning of the evening, when the shops were still lit up. The second witness, a passerby, recalled seeing Laura later, when the area was starting to thin out, and the pace of activity was slowing down. Meanwhile, the third witness gave an even later time frame, describing the surrounding scene as almost completely quiet, with streetlights becoming the main source of illumination. 3 statements, 3 time points, all of which seemed reasonable on their own, but when placed side by side, they could not all be correct. The investigators began cross-referencing these statements with the limited data they had available. They examined each witness's location at the time of their statement, their relationship to Laura, and their familiarity with the area. There were no signs that anyone was deliberately lying. The discrepancies in time could simply stem from human memory, from estimating hours based on perception, rather than a clock. But for a missing person case, a few minutes difference could be enough to alter the entire understanding of what had happened. The investigators were forced to make a procedural decision, select one time point as the primary basis for continuing to build the timeline. That decision was not made arbitrarily. They considered which time point best aligned with the expected route Laura usually took, which one matched the normal rhythm of the area more closely, and which one conflicted least with the confirmed information. In the end, one time point deemed the most reasonable was chosen as the main axis for the timeline, not because it was certainly correct, but because it allowed the investigation to move forward, rather than become stuck in parallel assumptions. The remaining time points were not completely discarded, but they were relegated to a secondary position, noted as possibilities to consider if the main assumption collapsed. From the selected time point, the investigators continued to break down the night of the disappearance into short segments, where Laura might have been after 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes. They marked intersections, road sections, places where a pedestrian might stop or change direction. On the map, a seemingly simple route began to be divided into multiple plausible branches, each corresponding to a different scenario. But all those scenarios were based on the same foundational assumption, that the most reasonable time point was correct. This was a point that at the time, no one saw as a risk. In investigative logic, there needs to be a main axis, otherwise, every direction would become scattered and lead nowhere specific. The choice of this time point also directly affected how the police allocated resources in the subsequent steps. Areas corresponding to the selected time frame were prioritized for searching first, while areas that only fit the other time points were considered less likely. There was no haste or carelessness in this decision. It was made based on experience and procedure, reflecting how hundreds of other missing persons cases had been handled. But what no one could know at that moment was that if the most reasonable time point was not the correct one, then the entire timeline built afterwards would stand on a foundation shifted by just a few minutes, small enough that no one noticed immediately, but large enough to steer the investigation in a different direction. When the first timeline was completed, it appeared neat and orderly, a clear starting point, a confirmed last seen location, and a sequence of minutes and hours leading to the gap where Laura was no longer seen. For the investigators, this was a necessary step, a way to turn a vague disappearance into a structure that could be analyzed. But within that neatness, a pivotal choice had been fixed, the choice about time, and from that moment on, every subsequent investigative step would follow it, unless something strong enough forced them to go back and question the very foundation they had just built. When the minute-by-minute timeline was temporarily fixed based on the point that the investigators deemed the most reasonable, the next procedural step followed almost as a professional reflex, delineating the final route that Laura Bennett might have walked home on the night she vanished. On the meeting table at Cleveland Police Headquarters, a map of Middlesbrough was spread out, no longer a vague whole but divided into specific streets, turns, and segments connecting where Laura left to the residential area where she lived. The investigators started from the most basic assumption: a young woman walking alone in the evening would most likely choose the familiar, well-lit and busier route rather than dark, deserted and poorly observable paths. This assumption was not a subjective prejudice, it stemmed from statistics and experience handling numerous similar cases over previous years. Based on that assumption, the reasonable routes were marked first. Streets with full street lighting, shops, bus stops and crowds during rush hour were placed in the priority group. The investigators scrutinized each segment, identifying intersections that Laura might have passed through if following her usual route. These routes had one thing in common: they allowed pedestrians to be easily seen, to call for help if needed, and made it less likely for a crime to occur unnoticed. In the context of the case having been classified as missing adult, no immediate risk, focusing on these routes further reinforced the sense that Laura might have encountered a non-dangerous interruption, or simply not yet returned home for some unexplained reason. Alongside marking the priority routes, the investigators also listed other paths Laura might have used, even if less familiar. These were shortcuts through industrial areas, back roads behind old warehouses, or unofficial paths that locals sometimes used to shorten the journey. However, when these were weighed up, they were quickly deemed unreasonable in the specific context of the case. They were darker, quieter, had fewer streetlights, and most importantly, did not fit the final image of Laura described by witnesses: someone leaving work normally, with no signs of anxiety or haste, showing no behavior suggesting she was deliberately avoiding anyone. Among the shortcuts considered and then discarded was one that passed through an old industrial area, where warehouses and goods yards had been operating at a reduced capacity for years. This route could shorten the journey home by a few minutes, but in exchange it offered poor lighting, few people in the evening, and no clear reason for Laura to choose it over the more familiar and safer route. In the investigative logic of that time, eliminating this route from the search area was seen as reasonable, even necessary, to avoid spreading resources too thinly into directions unlikely to yield results. The decision was noted briefly in the file: this route not consistent with the victim's expected behavior. Once the priority routes had been delineated, the search plan was built around them. The investigators divided the area, identifying segments needing closer scrutiny, intersections where Laura might have stopped or changed direction. Everything was organized around a single axis. Laura had taken the brightest and busiest route. This logical axis linked directly to the most reasonable time point selected during the timeline construction phase. These two elements, time and space, began to lock tightly together, forming a consistent investigative framework, at least on paper. However, this very consistency carried a silent consequence. When a route was eliminated from the search scope, it was not simply crossed off the map, it was pushed out of the entire investigation's focus. Witnesses who might have been near that route were not prioritized for re-interview. Possibilities occurring on that route were not detailed in scenarios. In subsequent meetings, the name of that shortcut was rarely mentioned, as it had been labeled unreasonable from the start, and in an investigation that relies heavily on narrowing possibilities, what is eliminated early tends to vanish completely from the investigator's line of thought. At that point, no one saw this decision as a mistake. It aligned with procedure, experience, and the initial image of Laura built in the file: a young woman walking home after work, choosing the safest route. That seemed an irreproachable assumption. But just like the time point chosen earlier, delineating the final route was also a foundational choice, shaping all subsequent steps of the search. If this assumption was correct, everything that followed would have a chance of leading to answers. If it was wrong, then everything outside that delineated area, the discarded shortcuts, the dark patches between streets, would remain as blank spaces on the map, not because they had been checked and proven harmless, but because they had never truly been looked at. When the final route was delineated, based on what were considered the most reasonable assumptions, the initial search phase was quickly rolled out within that scope. Cleveland police investigators began by sweeping the public areas along the priority routes: pavements outside shops, bus stops, busy intersections, spaces that a pedestrian would have to pass through to get home via the familiar route. This was the type of search known internally as a quick sweep, not deep, not assuming complex scenarios, but focused on confirming one basic thing: whether there was any clear evidence that Laura Bennett had encountered an incident on the route everyone believed she had taken. These areas were chosen not only for behavioral plausibility, but also because they allowed the search team to cover many points in a short time, fitting the missing adult, no immediate risk classification the case carried. The first steps proceeded quite quietly. Officers walked along the main roads, observing the ground, steps, dark spaces between shops where someone might pause or rest. They spoke to those still in the area early in the morning, cleaners, shop owners opening up, early bus drivers. Questions followed the same pattern. Did you hear anything unusual last night? See anyone in trouble? Hear any cries for help or arguments? The answers were almost identical. No, no strange noises, no scenes of struggle, nothing striking enough to be remembered. This silence, in the early stage, was seen as a positive signal, reinforcing the assumption that no overt violence had occurred on the prioritized routes. Alongside the ground sweep, the investigators also looked for signs that might suggest a secondary scene: bloodstains, scattered belongings, drag marks, or any disturbance in public spaces. But the more they searched, the more they noticed something remarkable. There was nothing to find. The road surfaces were clean, steps intact, no personal items clearly left behind. Places where, if an assault or accident had occurred, some trace would likely remain showed nothing unusual. In that context, the preliminary conclusion of the quick sweep phase gradually formed. No signs of struggle on the delineated routes, the absence of a clear secondary scene, gave the initial search phase a very particular characteristic. It did not generate new questions, but merely confirmed the lack of answers. For the investigators, this meant there was no reason to immediately expand the search beyond the previously identified routes. No hotspots, no locations to cordon off, no area emerging as a focal point needing deeper investigation. Everything aligned with the assumption that Laura had passed through without incident, or that if something had happened, it had not occurred openly in these spaces. The quick sweep approach also reflected the priority level assigned to the case. With the missing adult, no immediate risk classification, resources were not mobilized at the highest level. No specialist forensic teams, no turning over every square meter or closing roads for searches. Instead, it was a controlled sweep sufficient to state that the main public areas had been checked and nothing noteworthy found. In internal reports, brief notes began to appear: no signs of struggle, no obvious secondary scene, nothing to suggest foul play at this stage. However, the very neatness of those notes also created a tacit consequence. With no secondary scene identified, the entire hypothesis of Laura encountering danger on her way home became harder to sustain. The investigation, though not yet formal, began to lean towards the possibility that her disappearance was not linked to a clear violent event in public space. This was not stated outright, but it influenced how the investigators thought about the next steps. If there were no traces here, then either Laura had left the area somehow, or something had happened in a place outside the current search scope. At this stage, no one called it a deadlock. The search had only just begun, and finding nothing in the first sweep was not unusual, but it laid the foundation for a chain of subsequent decisions, in which the swept areas gradually came to be viewed as eliminated. When a route was quickly swept and left no trace, it began to fade from the priority list, making way for other hypotheses quietly forming. Meanwhile, the spaces outside the initial delineated area, the dark paths, the deserted industrial zones, remained beyond the search's reach, not because they had been checked and proven harmless, but because the initial quick sweep had given no reason to direct attention towards them. And in a missing person case, finding nothing in the early stage is sometimes not just a result, but the starting point for how the entire investigation will continue to progress. When the initial quick sweep phase yielded no signs of struggle or a clear secondary scene, the investigators returned to what they had left: witness statements. At this stage, every account, no matter how small or vague, was reviewed again to see if any piece of information did not fit the calm picture that the priority routes had just created. It was during this process that one statement emerged as a discordant detail. The witness was a woman working a late shift at a premises near where Laura was last seen, who said that on that evening, she had seen Laura stop and speak briefly with a man. According to her description, the conversation was not loud, with no threatening gestures or physical altercation, just two people standing facing each other on the pavement, long enough to draw attention, but not enough to prompt anyone to intervene. This statement was immediately weighed against the previously established assumptions. The investigators asked in detail about the location where the witness saw the incident, the estimated time, and Laura's subsequent direction of movement. The issue was not that the statement directly contradicted other information, but that it did not align with the reasonable route that had been delineated. The location indicated by the witness lay off the bright and busy routes, closer to an area that had been excluded from the search scope in the previous phase. If this statement was accurate, it would place Laura in a space that the investigators had decided not to prioritize, meaning the entire logic about her final route would have to be reconsidered. In the context of limited resources and no clear signs of violence, this statement was quickly labeled off-route. This was not an accusation that the witness was lying, but a procedural assessment that the information did not fit the investigative direction being pursued. The investigators considered the possibility of confusion. Perhaps the witness had seen another woman with a similar appearance, or her memory had blended details from different evenings. There was no supporting evidence, no second witness, no physical evidence, no indication that the conversation had led to a serious event. In internal reports, the statement was recorded, but with a brief note that it was not consistent with the expected route. The next decision was made quietly but firmly. This statement would not be included on the main investigative map. That map, built on the most reasonable timeline and the priority routes, was the central tool for allocating searches and spatial analysis. Anything not appearing on that map was almost non-existent in the main flow of the investigation. The off-route witness was thus pushed to the periphery, not because their information was entirely dismissed, but because it was not deemed strong enough to shake the established structure. At that moment, this decision seemed reasonable. The conversation described by the witness carried no signs of threat. The man was not described in detail, with no distinctive features, no behavior that made Laura appear frightened. If this statement were brought to the center, the investigators would have to expand the search into areas they had just excluded, entailing a dispersal of resources and questioning prior agreed decisions. In a case classified as missing adult, no immediate risk, such caution was seen as necessary to avoid going off track. However, not incorporating this statement into the investigative map also carried a consequence that was not immediately apparent. When a detail is deemed off-route, it is not merely shelved, it loses its ability to interact with other facts. If another statement later emerged in the same area, it would not be automatically linked. If physical evidence were found nearby, it would not be cross-checked against the conversation the witness described. That piece remained isolated in the file, not attached to the overall picture being constructed. In the following days, the statement about the man and the brief conversation gradually sank to the bottom of the file, making way for information more aligned with the main investigative direction. It was not erased, not denied, but neither was it pursued. For the investigators at the time, this was a reasonable decision based on what they knew and what they had not yet seen. But in a missing person case, details labeled off-route are often the easiest to forget because they do not fit the accepted logic. And when such a detail is not placed correctly on the investigative map, it can lie quietly in the file for years, waiting for someone to come back and wonder why, from the very beginning, it was not seen as part of the story that needed to be told. The shelving of the off-route statement allowed the search to continue revolving around the routes delineated from the start, but just a few days later, a new discovery forced the investigators to add another piece to the file, a personal item identified as belonging to Laura Bennett. The item was reported by a member of the public during a cleanup of a public area near the gradually expanding search scope after the initial quick sweep phase. It was not directly on the priority route, but not far enough to be considered completely outside the area of interest. When brought to the station, the item was quickly identified through the family's description, and there was no doubt it belonged to Laura. This was the first time since the night she vanished that the investigation had something tangible, a physical trace that could be placed on the analysis table. However, as the initial attention subsided, difficult questions immediately arose. No one could pinpoint exactly when the item appeared there. No witness said they had seen it on the night Laura vanished. nor did anyone recall seeing it the next day. The discovery area was a place with many passers-by, enough for an object to be overlooked for hours, or even days without notice. This made the item more of a vague sign than clear evidence. It showed that Laura had been present at some point in public space, but it said nothing about how or why she left that point. The investigators examined the item according to procedure. There were no signs of damage, no tears, no unusual stains suggesting a struggle. No blood was visible to the naked eye, and in the context of limited resources in the early phase, the item was not seen as evidence of violence. Instead, it was recorded as a separated personal property, a detail to be retained, but not strong enough to change the case classification. In internal reports, the comment was carefully noted, no basis to determine criminal behavior. The location of the item's discovery was added to the investigative map, but with a different marker from the focal points. It did not become a new center of search, but merely a secondary point to monitor if further relevant information emerged. The investigators discussed the possibility that the item had fallen out while Laura was walking, or had been placed there later by an undetermined factor. Both possibilities could not be ruled out, and it was this uncertainty that made the discovery difficult to integrate into the ongoing investigative logic. Notably, the discovery of this personal item did not create a strong procedural impetus. No secondary scene was established around it, no area was cordoned off, and there was no decision to raise the case priority level. Instead, it was seen as an additional detail to a picture that was already missing definition. In the context of the priority routes, having been swept without showing signs of struggle, finding an intact item further reinforced the thinking that if Laura had encountered an incident, it was not an overt violent event. This discovery also posed a difficult choice for the investigators, whether to reconsider the routes previously excluded. The item's location was not clear enough to force that. It lay in a gray area, not fully matching the chosen logical route, but not contradictory enough to reject that route. Ultimately, the decision was to maintain the main investigative direction, while noting the item as a detail to revisit if further evidence appeared later. In the file, Laura's item was packaged, sealed, and stored according to procedure. It became one of the few material things directly linked to her in the entire early investigation. But at that time, it did not carry the weight that a pivotal piece of evidence usually has. It did not answer where Laura had gone, who she had met, or what had happened after the last moment she was seen. Instead, it merely confirmed a chilling fact: Laura had been somewhere out there close enough to leave a trace of herself, but far enough that no one could say for certain what had happened next. And in an investigation shaped by initial assumptions, this discovery was placed in the file as a puzzle piece without a position, awaiting a different context in the future to be understood in its true meaning. After Laura Bennett's personal item was recorded without clear signs of violence, the investigation entered a phase where the investigators were forced to do what was familiar but difficult: form hypotheses. With few new facts to cling to, they returned to everything they had collected: the constructed timeline, the delineated routes, witness statements, and the discovery of the item, to see which scenarios could most reasonably explain Laura's disappearance in the current context. Two hypotheses emerged, and were considered most seriously, both possibilities not directly involving criminal behavior. Laura left voluntarily, or Laura suffered an undetected accident. The hypothesis that Laura left voluntarily was placed on the table first, as it fitted many recorded factors. Laura was an adult, with no signs of coercion at work, no evidence of an attack on the priority routes, and no secondary scene left to suggest intervention by others. An adult changing plans voluntarily, going somewhere without immediately informing family, though concerning, was not uncommon in missing persons files. The investigators considered the possibility that Laura had decided to visit someone, stay overnight, or simply needed space after work. The absence of violence indicators in the quick sweep phase, and the intact condition of the personal item further made this hypothesis seem more plausible within the missing adult, no immediate risk classification framework. Alongside this, the accident hypothesis was also raised. Middlesbrough is an industrial city with many areas in decline, poorly maintained roads, and public spaces that could pose risks, especially at night. The investigators weighed the possibility that Laura had slipped, been injured, or fallen into an area difficult to observe, where she could not seek help herself. However, when this hypothesis was cross-checked against the existing facts, it quickly reached limits. There were no reports of traffic accidents, no one discovered an injured person in the search area, and no physical signs indicated such an incident on the swept routes. An accident could have happened, but there was no specific evidence to turn that possibility into a main investigative direction. Importantly, neither hypothesis was strong enough to change the case's classification. Neither provided evidence that Laura was in immediate danger. No new factor forced the police to upgrade the case to higher priority, no basis to mobilize additional resources or implement emergency measures. In internal meetings, a cautious common conclusion was recorded: no clear indication of foul play at this stage. Not upgrading the danger level did not mean the case was forgotten, but it shaped the pace and scope of subsequent steps. The investigation continued at a monitoring level, with open hypotheses but none sharp enough to drive specific action. The investigators noted that the voluntary departure and accident hypotheses both needed new information to be reinforced or ruled out, but at that point, no sources promised to provide that in the short term. In this context, the discovery of Laura's personal item was placed within the same frame of thought. It could be a sign that she changed route or stopped somewhere, but it could also simply be a dropped item without serious meaning. There was no way to determine which hypothesis it leaned towards more. Similarly, the off-route statement about the man Laura was said to have spoken to lacked the weight to break the two main hypotheses, as it came without clear threatening or violent behavior. When hypotheses were formed but none predominated, the investigation fell into the familiar limbo of many missing persons cases. All possibilities were kept open on paper, but none was strong enough to prompt decisive action. In the file, the investigators recorded that the case was still under review, that any new information would be assessed when it appeared, and that the search would continue within reasonable limits. But the very absence of a dominant hypothesis was a sign that the investigation was gradually losing its initial momentum. With no clear danger to address and no evidence to pursue, Laura Bennett's disappearance began to be placed among cases where time, rather than urgent action, would determine the next direction. When the main hypotheses had been established but none carried enough weight to upgrade the danger level, the search moved to phase 2 with a very clear characteristic narrowing. There was no official announcement of scaling down, but in operational reality, it happened naturally and almost inevitably. Manpower was reduced to serve newly arising cases, other shifts needing higher priority, and Laura Bennett's missing persons file gradually shifted from active to maintenance status. The investigators continued to monitor the case, but the search intensity was no longer as in the early days. Frequent sweeps were replaced by selective checks, focusing on areas marked as possible based on the chosen timeline and routes. Alongside reducing manpower, a structural decision was made: some areas would be permanently eliminated from the sweep plan. This was not a decision made in a tense meeting or after a shocking discovery, but the result of accumulated logic from previous phases. Areas that had been quickly swept without finding signs of struggle, routes deemed unreasonable from the start, and spaces not matching assumptions about Laura's behavior were successively crossed off the priority list. On the investigative map, the bold areas gradually shrank, while the white areas, places never thoroughly searched, were not added to, but simply ignored. For the investigators, this was the only way to avoid spreading resources into directions yielding no results in the absence of new evidence. This narrowing also reflected the increasingly clear belief that if Laura had suffered a serious incident, signs of it would surely have appeared somewhere in the initial search scope. When that did not happen, the possibility that her disappearance involved overt criminal behavior on familiar routes gradually came to be seen as low. The eliminated areas were not noted as safe, but as no longer requiring further sweep, a small difference in wording but significant operationally. Once an area fell into this group, it almost never appeared in subsequent discussions, unless completely new information forced a complete re-examination. For Laura's file, this meant that the dark paths, deserted industrial areas, and spaces previously assessed as off-logical route officially disappeared from the active search plan. The investigation now operated on the inertia of prior decisions, the chosen timeline, the delineated routes, the formed hypotheses. Each narrowing step made returning to the starting point harder. As fewer areas remained in the sweep scope, more possibilities were eliminated without ever being fully checked. In internal reports, updates became shorter and less dense, reflecting the reality of no significant new developments. Phase 2 of the search closed not with a specific discovery, but with prolonged silence, a silence legitimized by procedure, by reasonable decisions at each individual moment, but when pieced together, they gradually pushed Laura Bennett's disappearance into a different state, no longer an active search, but a file maintained while awaiting something new to emerge, if it ever did. After many months had passed since the night Laura Bennett vanished, her file gradually bore the familiar signs of a case running out of leads. No new calls, no additional witnesses, no physical discoveries strong enough to alter the hypotheses formed in the early weeks. What had once been seen as possibilities to monitor were successively checked within allowable limits, and the results always returned to the same point. No new facts. In periodic updates, the investigators were forced to repeat familiar notes that the case remained open, but with no significant progress. That repetition, over time, became a signal that the investigation was entering the final phase of its active life cycle. The decision to shift the case to cold case status was not made abruptly. It was the result of a prolonged evaluation process, in which each element of the file was reviewed again, the constructed minute-by-minute timeline, the delineated routes, witness statements, the discovery of the personal item, and the hypotheses that had been considered. Each element, taken individually, was insufficient to drive a new step forward. When placed side by side, they formed a consistent but empty picture, pointing to no next course of action. With limited resources and pressure from new cases requiring priority, Cleveland police was forced to make a difficult but familiar choice: close the active search file for Laura Bennett. In operational language, closing the file does not mean the case is forgotten or completely abandoned. Laura's file was not shelved or destroyed, it was moved to a different status, where it was archived, preserved, and ready to be reopened if new information emerged. But in practical terms, this transition marked a significant turning point. Regular search activities ceased. Periodic update meetings were no longer scheduled. The investigators who had been attached to the case were reassigned to other duties, taking with them the assumptions and decisions that had shaped the investigation from the beginning. When the file was officially classified as a cold case, many areas once within the search scope were no longer considered. The previous narrowing decisions were now frozen, becoming a fixed part of the file. The paths eliminated early from the search plan, the statements labeled off-route, and the details that did not fit the main hypothesis all lay quietly in the documents, unconnected to one another. At that time, no one questioned whether those pieces could be reassembled differently. The priority had shifted to maintaining the file rather than restructuring it. The shift to cold case status also carried an implicit psychological meaning for those in investigative work. It was an admission that with the tools and information available, the case could not be solved in the near future. There was no confession, no new forensic evidence, and no unexpected event forcing a complete re-examination of the file. In the context of the 1990s, when investigative technology was far more limited than in the future, it was not uncommon for a missing persons case without a body to fall into this state. Laura Bennett's file thus joined a long list of other names, people who had vanished without leaving clear answers. When the file door closed, silence became the official state of the case. There was no fanfare announcement, no clear milestone for outsiders to recognize that the search had stopped, but internally, the change was undeniable. Laura Bennett's disappearance now existed as a marked document file, waiting for something unpredictable, a new witness, an incidental discovery, or a technological advance in the future. At that moment, no one could say whether that day would ever come. The only certainty was that, From the moment the file was transferred to cold case status, time became the only factor continuing to operate the case, not moving forward, but quietly accumulating, carrying unanswered questions and decisions fixed in the first months of the investigation. Many years after Laura Bennett's missing persons file was transferred to cold case status, her name remained quietly in the Cleveland police storage system, alongside numerous other unsolved cases. Time passed, people changed, and so did investigative methods. When the cold case unit was strengthened with the task of reviewing old cases through new perspectives and standards, Laura Bennett's file was once again pulled from the shelf, not because a sudden lead emerged, but because the very absence of answers after all those years made the case a candidate for a comprehensive re-examination. The cold case unit investigators began by doing what no one had previously had the opportunity to do, reading the entire 1994 records from start to finish, without skipping any page. This review process was not aimed at finding a sensational overlooked detail, but at assessing how the initial investigation had been built and directed. The records were placed side by side in chronological order, from the first missing person report call, the opening of the missing person file, to the quick sweep reports, the narrowing of searches, and finally the decision to shift to cold case. When viewed in the light of accumulated experience over the years, some operational decisions began to reveal gaps. They were not obvious mistakes, but choices made in a context of limited information, yet fixed too early in the investigative structure. The first point that caught the cold case unit's attention was the way the most reasonable time point had been selected during the timeline construction phase. The record showed at least 3 different time points provided by witnesses, but only one was used as the main axis for the entire investigation. The others were noted but never fully integrated into search scenarios. From the current perspective, this was seen as a decision lacking solid foundation, as no physical evidence confirmed the chosen time point as more accurate than the others. Choosing one point to move forward was necessary operationally, but not revisiting that decision when the search yielded no results was another issue. Next, the cold case unit examined how Laura's final route had been delineated. The file showed that prioritizing bright, busy routes was built on assumptions about the victim's reasonable behavior, rather than specific evidence. Some paths were eliminated from the search scope from the outset because they were deemed inconsistent with that assumption, without any record showing they had been physically checked. When compared with other cases solved in recent years, the cold case investigators realized that the areas eliminated earliest were often where the most important leads were found. In Laura Bennett's case, the permanent elimination of certain areas from the sweep plan was seen as an operational decision lacking verification. The off-route witness statement was also reconsidered. The 1994 records showed this statement had been labeled inconsistent and not included on the main investigative map. There was no indication that it had ever been deeply cross-checked against other facts or re-evaluated, when initial hypotheses failed to yield results. For the cold case unit, this was a classic example of information not fitting the main assumption being pushed to the margins, rather than kept as a parallel possibility to monitor. Even the discovery of Laura's personal item was re-examined from a new angle. Rather than viewing it merely as a neutral detail, the cold case investigators questioned its location and timing of appearance in relation to the excluded routes. They recognized that the inability to determine when it appeared did not mean it lacked value, but only that it had not yet been placed in a suitable scenario. As the review continued, a conclusion gradually formed within the cold case unit. The initial investigation had been guided by a chain of reasonable decisions at each individual step, but lacked a mechanism for self-check and adjustment when those decisions failed to produce results. There was no single mistake large enough to explain why the case reached a deadlock. Instead, it was a series of small choices, each reasonable at the time, but when accumulated, they formed a closed structure that did not allow other possibilities to be fully considered. This realization led to Laura Bennett's file not only being reopened on paper, but becoming the subject of a new investigation, one not aimed at immediately seeking new leads, but at dismantling the old assumptions that had once been deemed unquestionable. Reopening the file did not stop at merely pointing out operational decisions from the past that lacked foundation. The next step for the cold case unit was to do what the 1994 investigation had been unable or too late to do: reconstruct the entire night. Laura Bennett vanished, from start to finish, not based on a single assumption, but on all the witness statements ever recorded. The investigators began by piecing together every fragment of old accounts, including those statements that had once been pushed outside the logical route. No detail was considered too small or too vague to ignore. Each witness was placed back in their exact position in space and time, with the question not being who is right, who is wrong, but what could have happened if they were all remembering a correct part. From the old records, the investigators compiled a complete list of everyone who had seen or could have seen Laura that night, along with the time they estimated. Instead of selecting a single most reasonable point, they kept all the time points in parallel, accepting that the truth might lie in their intersections or gaps. When these points were placed side by side, one thing became clear: the statements did not contradict each other absolutely, but only overlapped imperfectly. Laura could have been seen earlier, later, or at multiple points within a much broader time frame than the original timeline. It was precisely the premature narrowing that caused the 1994 investigation to miss this possibility. Alongside piecing together the statements, the cold case unit constructed a detailed movement map for the night of the disappearance. No longer just a single route, the new map included all the paths Laura could have taken, based on witness locations, the location of the discovered personal item, and areas previously excluded from the search plan. Each route was marked in a different color, with the corresponding time frame, forming a network of possibilities rather than a single straight line. When looking at this map, the investigators realized that the areas once deemed unreasonable actually lay at the intersection of multiple different movement scenarios. Another important factor incorporated into the new reconstruction was realistic movement speed. Rather than assuming Laura walked continuously at an average pace, the investigators considered the possibility that she stopped, spoke, or changed direction for short periods. It was here that the off-route witness statement about Laura stopping to talk to a man began to gain a clearer place. When placed on the detailed movement map, this statement was no longer an outlier, but became a point that could explain why Laura did not appear at the positions the original timeline predicted she should have been. As the routes and statements were overlaid, a critical time gap began to emerge. This was not a gap spanning hours, but a short segment, only a few tens of minutes, lying between 2 points previously seen as continuous. In the 1994 timeline, this period had been flattened by the assumption that Laura walked straight from the last seen point home along her familiar route. But in the new reconstruction, that gap appeared as a blurred zone, with no direct witness statements, no confirming data, and no actual search activity ever conducted there. It lay precisely at the intersection between the priority route and a shortcut that had been eliminated early. The cold case unit spent considerable time analyzing this gap. They asked if Laura did not go straight, but stopped or turned in another direction during that time. What could have happened without leaving traces on the swept routes? This question led them back to the discovery of Laura's personal item. When its location was placed on the new map, it sat right on the edge of that critical time gap, as a sign that Laura had been present there, but not in the way the original investigation had imagined. Reconstructing the night of the disappearance in this way also allowed the investigators to reassess the hypotheses formed earlier. The hypothesis of Laura leaving voluntarily became harder to sustain when the time gap showed an interruption not explained by voluntary behavior. Similarly, the accident hypothesis did not explain why Laura appeared at this location and time without any reports or discoveries in the initial search phase. The critical time gap became an open question, not leaning heavily towards any hypothesis, but sufficient to indicate that something had happened outside the old frame of thinking. When the new reconstruction was complete, the cold case investigators did not see an immediate answer, but they saw something more important: a night of disappearance that had once been compressed into a simple sequence was now expanded into a complex structure with multiple parallel possibilities. That critical time gap was not a random flaw, but a direct consequence of selecting and eliminating too early in the original investigation. It was this gap, identified clearly for the first time after many years, that became the new anchor for the entire subsequent investigative direction. It did not say who Laura met, or what happened, but it pinpointed the place and time where that question needed to be asked again, this time with the entire file expanded, and with the determination not to repeat the assumptions that had once let the truth slip away. When the critical time gap was identified in the reconstruction of the night of the disappearance, the cold case unit returned to the statements that had been sidelined, especially the one labeled off route in 1994. This witness, who had said they saw Laura Bennett stop and talk to a man, was no longer outside the new investigative map. In the newly reconstructed logical structure, the location and time described by the witness lay precisely on the edge of the time gap the investigators were trying to explain. What had once been deemed inconsistent with the old assumption now matched the new picture in an unsettling way, forcing the cold case unit to question not the reliability of the witness, but why this statement had been eliminated so early. The investigators contacted the witness again, this time not to mechanically reconfirm the old story, but to reconstruct the circumstances in which the statement was formed. They asked about the lighting, distance, standing position, and seemingly trivial details such as wind direction, traffic noise, and estimated time based on the rhythm of the night shift. The witness did not change her story. She did not say Laura appeared frightened, nor did she describe an argument, but it was precisely the normality of that brief conversation that became the pivotal point in the new logic. If Laura had stopped to talk, even for a few minutes, the entire original timeline, which assumed she walked straight home, would be shattered. When this statement was placed on the detailed movement map, the investigators realized that the stopping point described by the witness lay near an area that had been excluded from the search scope in the early phase. This was a transitional space, neither fully on the main route, nor entirely the unreasonable shortcut. In the 1994 investigation, this area had not been thoroughly swept, as it was not on the priority route, and showed no overt signs of struggle. But in the new logic, it became a potential access point, where Laura could have turned off her familiar route during the critical time gap. The cold case unit began to view this access point as a central link, rather than a peripheral detail. They cross-referenced it with the location where Laura's personal item was found, and noticed that the 2 points were not only close spatially, but could also be connected temporally. That item, previously seen as a neutral detail, could now represent the moment Laura left the usual flow of movement. There was no evidence of violence occurring there, but neither was there evidence that Laura had voluntarily left according to a pre-planned course. This access point became the only place on the entire new map where all three elements, the statement, the personal item, and the time gap converged. The fact that the old statement now aligned with the new logic forced the investigators to reassess how the original investigation had handled inconsistent information. In the 1994 file, this statement was discarded not because it contradicted the truth, but because it contradicted the chosen assumption. The cold case unit noted that this was a classic example of confirmation bias, the tendency to seek and retain only information that reinforced existing assumptions, while eliminating what would force questions to be reopened. This realization was not personal criticism, but aimed at clarifying how an investigation could veer off course without any obvious single mistake. With the access point identified, the investigative direction began to shift. Rather than continuing to revolve around the hypotheses of voluntary departure or accident, the cold case investigators started asking questions about the interaction between Laura and the man the witness had seen. No one knew who the man was, what their relationship was, or what the conversation was about, but Laura stopping to talk, in an area not on the priority route, indicated a deliberate change in her journey, a change unexplained by previous hypotheses. This access point was not the solution, but it was an entirely new approach compared to the 1994 investigation. It opened the possibility that Laura's disappearance did not occur randomly, nor was it entirely beyond human control. Instead, it suggested there was a specific moment, at a specific location, where Laura's path turned in another direction, and that moment had once lain outside the investigation's view for many years. Bringing back the previously discarded witness not only added a piece to the new picture, but also proved that the answer to this disappearance may have been in the file all along, waiting only for the old logic to be dismantled to reveal the correct path forward. Identifying a specific access point from the previously discarded statement created a chain reaction in the review of the old file. When a new moment and location were placed at the center of the night of the disappearance, the cold case unit was forced to revisit a question that had almost been forgotten, who had once been considered, and then eliminated, simply because they did not fit the original timeline. From this point, a name resurfaced in Laura Bennett's file, not as a new discovery, but as an old detail buried beneath assumptions once deemed certain. In the 1994 records, this man had been mentioned briefly during the initial information gathering phase. He lived and worked not far from the area where the off-route witness said Laura had stopped to talk. No official relationship was confirmed between him and Laura, but his name appeared for a simple reason: he was present in the area that evening and had been seen talking to several pedestrians passing by. However, when the most reasonable timeline was chosen as the main axis for the investigation, his presence was quickly deemed irrelevant. According to the time point accepted at the time, he could not have been at the position Laura was believed to have passed through simultaneously. The issue was not his behavior, but that he did not match the fixed timeline. When the file was reopened, the cold case unit reread that section of the record from an entirely different perspective. They realized that eliminating this name was not based on exclusionary evidence, but on incompatibility with a time assumption. There was no record showing he had a solid alibi, nor any document proving he could not have accessed Laura during the critical time gap now identified. He was simply sidelined because he was at the wrong time according to a timeline now proven to lack foundation. The investigators began reconstructing this suspect's schedule on the night Laura vanished, this time not relying on the old time points. They gathered data from the old file again: shift end times, travel habits, places he commonly appeared in the evening. Information once deemed unimportant was now subjected to detailed analysis. When his schedule was placed parallel to the new movement map of Laura, something notable emerged. During the critical time gap, nothing proved that the two could not have met. On the contrary, the suspect's location and the access point just identified by the cold case unit lay within the same plausible space. The re-emergence of this name did not immediately make him the primary suspect. The cold case unit understood the difference between being reconsidered and being charged, but his return highlighted a larger issue in the original investigation, allowing the timeline to dictate suspect selection, rather than letting suspects and evidence retest the timeline. In 1994, when a time point was chosen as the axis, anything not matching it was deemed irrelevant. Now, with that axis dismantled, what had been eliminated began to resurface as possibilities never fully explored. The cold case unit continued reviewing how this name had been handled in the old file. They noted that the initial interview, if it could be called an interview, had only reached the level of basic information verification. There was no detailed confrontation, no cross-checking of his statements against other witnesses, and no effort to place him in the broader context of the night of the disappearance. Partly because there was no direct evidence, and partly due to pressure to focus on more reasonable directions according to the logic of the time. Once the timeline ruled him out, the need to delve into his role vanished. The return of the suspect from the old file also prompted the cold case investigators to re-examine the connection between him and the previously discarded witness statement. The general description of the man Laura spoke to, build, clothing, position, was not detailed enough to confirm they were the same person, but it was also not different enough to rule it out. In the 1994 investigation, this uncertainty was the reason to dismiss the connection. In the new logic, it became a reason to ask questions. When this name was brought back to the investigative table, a subtle but significant shift occurred in the case's direction. The investigation no longer revolved solely around where Laura had gone, but began to center on who she had met during that critical time gap. The suspect once eliminated for not matching the timeline was now seen as a warning, If the original timeline was flawed, then every decision based on it needed re-examination from the beginning. And in Laura Bennett's case, eliminating a name simply because he was at the wrong time may have caused the investigation to miss the only opportunity to ask the right question at the right moment. The reappearance of this suspect did not bring an immediate confession or new evidence, but it marked a clear turning point. For the first time in many years, Laura Bennett's file had a specific individual to focus on, not as a vague assumption, but as a person who had once stood very close to the center of the story, then pushed to the margins by a chain of operational decisions. Now, with the old logic dismantled, that name returned not as a shadow in the file, but as a possibility that needed to be thoroughly checked, this time, without letting a flawed timeline decide in place of the truth. The re-emergence of a suspect from the old file at the center of attention created an urgent requirement for the cold case unit. They needed something beyond inference and reconstruction logic, a factor that could stand the test of time and independent verification. The answer lay in the very physical evidence once deemed insufficient in 1994, with forensic investigative technology having advanced significantly over the past 2 decades. What had once been sealed and stored now had the chance to speak again in a completely different way. The cold case unit began by reviewing all evidence related to Laura Bennett's disappearance, particularly the personal item found during the initial search phase. In 1994, the ability to analyze biological traces on items without obvious blood was very limited. Laura's item was only superficially checked, showed no signs of violence, and was therefore not seen as a key piece of evidence. But with modern analysis techniques, especially the ability to collect and decode low-level DNA, the cold case unit realized that this item could contain far more information than the naked eye or old methods could detect. The decision was made to send the evidence for reanalysis, this time with the aim of finding any trace of contact, however small, that previous methods could not identify. The analysis process proceeded slowly and meticulously. Forensic experts focused on surfaces likely to have been touched under normal conditions, fabric edges, zippers, or points where another person might have inadvertently left traces when holding, pulling, or grasping. No one in the cold case unit expected an immediate clear result. They understood that in many old cases, reanalysis of evidence was often merely eliminative, confirming that no further information could be extracted. But this time, the result carried an entirely different significance. The biological trace discovered was not something dramatic like blood or injury, but evidence of contact, something that in 1994 was almost impossible to extract and identify. The analysis showed that on Laura's personal item there was DNA from at least 2 people, one matching Laura's profile, and one not matching anyone in her family. This in itself was not proof of crime. A personal item can carry DNA from multiple people during everyday use. But when this result was placed alongside the new investigative logic, it immediately shifted the focus of inference. The cold case unit continued cross-referencing the forensic results with the file. They checked whether in 1994 anyone had legally handled the item, shop staff, the person who reported it, or police who collected it. The archived records allowed those possibilities to be ruled out. The remaining DNA trace did not match any individual recorded as having contacted the evidence after Laura vanished. This did not confirm that the DNA belonged to the perpetrator, but it did confirm that Laura's item had been touched by an unidentified person in the period before it was found. When this result was incorporated into the overall analysis, an old hypothesis began to collapse. The hypothesis that Laura left voluntarily, based on the absence of violence signs and no clear secondary scene, now became difficult to sustain. If Laura had voluntarily left her familiar route for personal reasons, the presence of unidentified DNA on her item needed explanation. It could be random, but in the context of the statement about Laura stopping to talk to a man, and the unexplained critical time gap, the voluntary departure hypothesis lost its solid foundation. The cold case unit also re-examined the accident hypothesis in light of the new evidence. A single accident could hardly explain why Laura's personal item bore traces of contact from another person without any related reports or discoveries. The accident hypothesis, already weak from the start due to the lack of physical signs, was now almost entirely ruled out from the main lines of inference. As the two non-criminal hypotheses were successively undermined, a different line of thinking began to form, though not yet stated as an official conclusion. If Laura had interacted with another person during the critical time gap, and if her personal item bore traces of contact from an unidentified individual, then the possibility of an event involving a human element, though not necessarily overt violence, became increasingly difficult to deny. This was a complete reversal from how the case was viewed in 1994, when all signs were interpreted as no immediate danger. This new evidence also directly impacted the re-evaluation of the suspect from the old file. The cold case unit did not rush to connect the unidentified DNA to any specific individual, but they realized that for the first time, the investigation had a piece of evidence independent of the timeline and statements, a piece of evidence not reliant on human memory or behavioral assumptions. It did not answer who did what, but it answered another crucial question. Laura had not been completely alone in the final moments recorded by the evidence. As old hypotheses were overturned, the investigative approach changed accordingly. Rather than trying to explain Laura's disappearance through passive scenarios, the cold case unit began to focus on the chain of interactions leading to the critical time gap. They asked who could have approached Laura, under what circumstances, and why that approach was not recorded in the initial search. The new evidence was not an accusation, but it was a catalyst forcing the entire file to be viewed with a different foundational assumption, that Laura Bennett's disappearance may not have been the result of personal choice or random accident, but the consequence of a specific encounter, an encounter that had once been undervalued, then overlooked, and only now, with technology permitting, began to leave traces clear enough that they could no longer be ignored. The emergence of new evidence forced the cold case unit to shift into an entirely different phase of investigation from previous years, but not in a noisy or public way. Instead of immediately summoning or interrogating, they chose a more cautious path, silent investigation. The goal was to verify the newly formed hypothesis, without revealing the direction, avoiding alerting the suspect or causing him to change his behavior. The man once eliminated from the file for not matching the timeline, now became the focus of a discrete chain of actions, carried out step by step, with strict discipline and known to few. The investigators began by surveilling the suspect in his current life. After many years, he had a different existence, stable work, clear social relationships, no major criminal record that would immediately stand out. The surveillance was not aimed at finding new criminal behavior, but at understanding his habits, daily rhythm, and how he moved through everyday spaces. Everything was recorded discreetly: times he left home, usual routes, means of transport, places he frequently visited. No unusual actions emerged, but it was precisely this normality that allowed the investigators to build a full picture of the man, separate from the vague image in the old file. Alongside current surveillance, the suspect's past was opened up for layer-by-layer re-examination. Personal records, employment history, and relationships in the early 1990s were scrutinized thoroughly. The cold case unit sought potential intersections between him and Laura Bennett, not only on the night of the disappearance, but in the months before. They asked whether the two could have met previously, even fleetingly, in spaces not recorded in the original file. There was no clear evidence of a close relationship, but neither was there proof they were complete strangers. This gap, like many others in the case, could not conclude anything on its own, but it was enough to keep the suspect under close watch. Another focus of the silent investigation was the means of transport. In 1994, personal vehicles were not seen as a key factor, partly because the hypothesis of Laura walking home dominated, and partly because there were no signs she had entered anyone's vehicle. But with the new logic, the investigators returned to this question. They verified whether the suspect owned or used any vehicle at the time, and if so, whether it could have accessed the identified access point during the critical time gap. Old registration records, insurance information, and indirect statements from acquaintances were carefully cross-referenced. Not all data remained complete after so many years, but the surviving fragments showed the suspect had greater mobility than the 1994 file had assumed. Reconstructing past travel routes was a major challenge. There were no cameras, no digitized data, and human memory had faded. But the cold case unit approached it differently. They compared his current travel habits with what could be inferred from the past. The routes the suspect commonly chose, the areas he was familiar with, and the places he avoided, were all brought into the analysis. When these facts were overlaid on the new movement map of Laura, a notable overlap emerged. Not direct evidence, but an opportunity fit. The suspect could have been in the right place, at the right time, in the gap the original investigation had overlooked. Throughout the silent investigation phase, one principle was upheld: no action was taken without a clear purpose and legal basis. The cold case unit understood they were walking a fine line between reasonable inference and dangerous speculation. Every piece of information gathered had to be verifiable, and every next step had to be prepared to withstand legal scrutiny. This made the investigative progress slow, but it also ensured that when they decided to take another step, it would be one with no turning back. As the surveillance and checks gradually accumulated sufficient data, the picture of the suspect became clearer than at any point in the past. He was no longer a faint name eliminated for not matching the timeline, but an individual with a history, habits, and access capability, fitting the new logic of the case. However, there remained a wide gap between suspicion and public action. The cold case unit still lacked direct evidence for confrontation, let alone grounds for arrest. What they had at this point was a converging chain of signs, enough to continue digging deeper, but also enough to remind them that any mistake now would not only affect the case, but could destroy the only chance to bring the truth to light after all these years of silence. As the pieces of data collected from the silent investigation began to converge, the cold case unit moved to a pivotal phase, reconstructing the crime scenario. This was not arbitrary imagination, but the process of connecting disjointed chains of events with operational logic, based on what had been verified and what could have happened in the identified critical time gap. The goal of this step was not to write a complete story for the sake of satisfaction, but to build a scenario tight enough to explain simultaneously the three major issues of the case: how Laura Bennett left her familiar route, what happened during the period with no direct witness statements, and why no witness saw a clear event. The scenario began from the identified access point, the moment Laura stopped to talk to the man in the transitional area between the priority route and the path once eliminated. According to the new logic, this was the point where Laura's journey first deviated from the predicted course. The brief conversation, as per the witness, showed no signs of tension. This explained why no one paid particular attention, and why Laura showed no fear or attempt to avoid. The investigators believed it was precisely this normality that allowed the moment to pass without leaving a strong enough impression for other witnesses to remember. From this access point, the scenario continued with the assumption that Laura agreed to go with the man for a short additional segment, or turned in another direction for a reason, not immediately coercive. This was the key element, explaining the absence of struggle signs on the main routes. If there was no overt resistance, no cries for help, and no conspicuous violence, the crowded public space would leave no traces for the initial search to discover. This was what made the old hypotheses of accident or voluntary departure seem reasonable in the context of limited information. The critical time gap, once flattened in the 1994 timeline, was now placed in its proper position in the scenario. It was a period long enough for Laura and the man to leave the lit and populated area, but not long enough for anyone to notice her absence immediately. In that gap, anything that happened lay outside the view of witnesses, questioned in the early phase, as they were only asked about the priority routes and predetermined time frames. The lack of direct witnesses thus no longer seemed puzzling, but became the inevitable consequence of how the original investigation delineated space and time. The scenario also explained the location and condition of Laura's personal item. Rather than an accidentally dropped object, it was placed in the chain of events as a sign of interruption. The item could have been separated from Laura during movement with the man, at a location not on the priority route, and thus not thoroughly swept. The absence of damage or violent signs on the item fitted the assumption that the event did not begin as an overt attack, but as a gradually escalating sequence of actions, only crossing into danger once out of public observation. Another major question the scenario had to answer was why no one saw Laura after that final moment, even though the city was not entirely deserted. The investigators believed the answer lay in the combination of three factors: timing, location, and expectation. The timing was when public life had slowed, when those still on the streets focused more on their own movement than observing surroundings. The location was an area not considered dangerous, but not busy enough for every action to be noticed. And the expectation was that a woman standing talking or walking with a man was not unusual, especially without clear signs of tension. These three factors combined to create a social blind spot, where a serious event could begin without being recognized. When the chain of events was connected in this way, the new scenario did not require unrealistic assumptions or extreme dramatic elements. It was based on everyday behaviors, small decisions, and normal moments misjudged as harmless. It was precisely this normality that explained why the original investigation, though conducted correctly by procedure, never touched the core of the case. No cries for help, no chase, no blood-soaked scene, only a chain of movements gradually leaving the light and attention. For the cold case unit, this crime scenario was not the final conclusion, but a reference framework. It allowed them to retest every piece of evidence, every statement, and every operational decision under a unified logic. More importantly, it provided a consistent explanation for what had kept this case deadlocked for many years. The absence of direct witnesses was not because nothing happened, but because what did happen occurred precisely in the place and time that no one was asked about, no one looked into, and no one thought needed attention. When the crime scenario had been reconstructed with logic tight enough to explain the chain of events, the cold case unit moved to the step they had prepared for over many months, but never rushed, presenting the file to the Crown Prosecution Service. This was the moment when every inference, every connection between statements, physical evidence, and behavior had to be held to the highest legal standard. The CPS cared nothing for a sense of reasonableness or investigative intuition. They needed to see a chain of evidence strong enough to prove that arresting an individual after many years was not only necessary, but capable of standing up in court. The file submitted included the entire case review process. The 1994 operational decisions that created investigative gaps, the new forensic evidence obtained from Laura Bennett's personal item, and the crime scenario reconstruction based on the new logic. In the closed exchanges between investigators and prosecutors, the focus was not on proving every detail of the night of the disappearance, but on proving that the suspect had opportunity, access capability, and a reasonable connection to the critical time gap. The CPS scrutinized why this suspect had not been arrested earlier, and the answer lay in the file: he had been eliminated not because he was proven innocent, but because he did not fit a hastily chosen timeline. When that timeline was dismantled, what remained was not speculation, but a converging chain of facts sufficient to raise serious suspicion. The unidentified DNA on Laura's item, though not incriminating in itself, played a pivotal role in breaking the old hypotheses and paving the way for the new investigative direction. After multiple rounds of evaluation, the CPS authorized the suspect's arrest for formal questioning. This decision was made with utmost caution, as it meant publicly reviving a case silent for many years and placing an individual under the spotlight of the justice system. The cold case unit received the approval notification quietly, without press releases or ostentatious moves. Everything was prepared as a covert operation, with the sole aim of ensuring the arrest proceeded safely, legally, and without compromising the value of the collected evidence. The suspect was arrested on an apparently ordinary morning, when his life had long drifted far from the night Laura Bennett vanished decades earlier. There was no chase, no significant resistance. The arrest was clean, by procedure, yet carried a particular weight for those involved. For the investigators, it was the moment when a file once deemed deadlocked officially entered a new phase. For the suspect, it was the moment when the past, seemingly buried under layers of time, returned with its full weight. In the interview room, the question was not only what the suspect would say, but whether the constructed chain of evidence was strong enough to withstand the pressure of truth. The cold case unit understood that the arrest was not the end, but the beginning of a greater challenge, turning a logical scenario into a case provable in court. But the moment the suspect was handcuffed, after years of Laura Bennett's file lying dormant on storage shelves, carried an undeniable meaning. It marked the first time since the night Laura did not return home that the legal system officially acknowledged her disappearance was not an unsolvable mystery, but an act that could be pursued. And with the CPS approval, the case stepped out of the shadows of cold case status and into the harsh light of justice, where every assumption would face the unrelenting scrutiny of the court. The trial of Laura Bennett's case opened in an atmosphere of rare tension, not only because so much time had passed since the night she vanished, but also because of the case's unique nature, one without a body. From the outset, the prosecution knew they could not rely on shocking imagery or traditional forensic conclusions to convince the jury. Instead, the entire case had to be built as a tightly closed logical chain, where every piece of evidence, every operational decision, and every gap was explained consistently. The focus was not on proving how Laura died, but on proving that her disappearance could not have been random, could not have been voluntary, and could not have been an undetected accident. The prosecution began by taking the jury back to 1994, reconstructing the context of an initial investigation conducted correctly by procedure, but constrained by the era's assumptions and technology. They presented how Laura left work, how the minute-by-minute timeline was built around a most reasonable point, and how the entire search revolved around the assumption of no immediate danger. Those decisions, the prosecution emphasized, were not deliberate errors, but they created a gap, the critical time gap the original investigation failed to see. That gap, the prosecution argued, was precisely where the truth had been hidden for many years. The defense quickly countered, focusing on the case's clearest weakness: no body, no primary scene, and no direct witness to a criminal act. They questioned whether a person could be convicted of a serious crime based solely on inference and reconstructed logic. Every piece of evidence presented by the prosecution was dissected through skeptical scrutiny: old witness statements prone to error, a personal item proving no violence, and unidentified DNA not pointing to the perpetrator on its own. According to the defense, the case relied too heavily on filling gaps rather than proving what actually happened. In the face of that confrontation, the prosecution shifted focus to the chain of evidence, rather than isolated pieces. They argued that in cases without a body, what matters is not one decisive piece of evidence, but how small pieces connect to exclude every reasonable innocent explanation. The statement discarded in 1994 was brought before the court, this time not as a peripheral detail, but as the starting point of the chain of events. The prosecution explained why it had not been pursued earlier, and why in the new logic it became central. By placing this statement alongside the detailed movement map and the critical time gap, they showed that Laura had left her familiar route under circumstances that were far from random. Laura's personal item was presented as a bridge between past and present. Forensic experts explained to the jury the difference between 1994 technology and modern analysis capabilities, stressing that the failure to detect violence traces earlier did not mean no interaction with another person. The unidentified DNA on the item, the prosecution argued, was not the sole evidence, but the factor that completely reversed the old hypotheses. It showed Laura had contact with another person during the critical time gap, something the voluntary departure or accident hypotheses could not satisfactorily explain. The defense continued to attack the validity of the inferences, arguing that DNA could appear in many harmless ways, and that the prosecution was assigning criminal meaning to neutral facts. They emphasized that the suspect had lived an ordinary life for many years, with no notable violent behavior, and that bringing an individual to trial after decades, based on a chain of assumptions, was extremely dangerous. Each time the prosecution presented a link in the evidence chain, the defense sought to weaken it, not by outright rejection, but by sowing doubt about the certainty of each link. The climax of the trial came when the prosecution presented the reconstructed crime scenario. They carefully avoided emotional language or speculation, instead describing the chain of events as a reasonable model, the normal conversation, the deviation from the familiar route, the time gap without witnesses, and the absence of overt traces. The prosecution stressed that it was precisely the normality of the initial steps that caused no one to notice anything unusual, and that this explained why the case left no clear traces. This scenario, they said, did not require the jury to believe in an implausible assumption, but only to accept that the most serious events sometimes occur in silence. In the closing arguments, both sides addressed the jury directly. The prosecution urged them to look at the whole picture, not isolated pieces, and asked whether any reasonable innocent explanation still stood when all the facts were fitted together. The defense, conversely, emphasized the fundamental principle of justice. If reasonable doubt remains, conviction is impossible. They warned of the risk of letting a sense of reasonableness replace direct evidence, especially in a case without a body. As the trial entered the deliberation phase, the tension was not confined to the courtroom, but spread to those who had followed the case for many years. Laura Bennett's case was no longer a cold file in storage, but a test for the justice system, whether justice can be served when time has erased the scene, faded memories, and forced the truth to be reconstructed from imperfect pieces. In the silence of the deliberation room, the answer to that test was slowly forming, not only for the defendant's fate, but for society's entire perception of cases that seem unsolvable. After many hours of deliberation in silence, the jury returned to the courtroom, carrying the weight of a decision that concerned not only the fate of one person, but also how justice confronts time. There was no whispering, no unnecessary movement. As everyone stood, the court clerk asked the familiar question that the entire trial had awaited: had the jury reached a verdict? The answer came short and clear, cutting through the tense atmosphere. Yes, the verdict was not delivered in a dramatic moment. It was read slowly, word by word, as if to emphasize that this was not a conclusion of emotion, but of a long and difficult process of consideration. The jury found the defendant guilty in relation to the circumstances surrounding Laura Bennett's disappearance. In the courtroom, there were no cheers, no explosive release. Instead, there was a heavy silence, for everyone understood that this was a case without a body, without a traditional crime scene, and therefore the verdict did not bring the usual sense of complete closure. The judge took time to explain the meaning of the verdict, emphasizing that the jury had not been persuaded by a single piece of evidence, but by the entire chain of evidence, considered as a whole. In that explanation, each element was reiterated: the critical time gap, the statement once discarded, the personal item with traces of contact, and the defendant's opportunity fit on the night Laura vanished. No single detail was sufficient on its own to convict, but when connected, they had excluded the reasonable innocent possibilities raised by the defense. The defense counsel quietly took notes, understanding that the battle in the courtroom had ended. Though the legal battle might not yet be over, they reserved the right to appeal, reiterating that this was a case based on inference and reconstruction, with no direct evidence of the victim's death. But at the moment the verdict was read, those arguments no longer carried enough weight to change the jury's conclusion. Justice, in the way the system could deliver it in these circumstances, had been served. For the investigators in the cold case unit, this moment held a different meaning. It was not a triumph, but a confirmation that the years spent reviewing the file, dismantling old assumptions, and patiently piecing together each fragment of data had not been in vain. The jury's verdict was an acknowledgement that a case once closed for lack of leads could be brought back into the light, not by luck, but by asking the right questions again. Meanwhile, the name Laura Bennett was mentioned in the courtroom as an absent presence. There was no final image, no forensic conclusion to close her life story. The verdict did not answer how Laura died, or where. It only affirmed that her disappearance was not random, and that criminal responsibility had been established according to the standards of the law. It was a form of justice that was incomplete, but the only form that could still be achieved after all those years. When the trial concluded, the defendant was led out of the courtroom in silence, with no violent reaction, no final words. Those present left slowly, carrying the heavy sense that this story had moved to its final chapter in the justice system, though it might not have ended in the minds of those affected. The jury's verdict did not erase the void Laura left behind, nor did it return the lost years. It only placed a clear marker. Society had looked back, had re-examined, and had concluded that the prolonged silence over many years was not evidence of innocence. In the quiet after the verdict, one thing became clear: justice, especially in cases without a body, does not always take the form of a complete answer. Sometimes, it is only the official acknowledgement that what happened can no longer be ignored, and that the gaps once accepted in the past have now been filled with responsibility. In the case of Laura Bennett, the jury's verdict was not the end of every question, but it was a powerful affirmation that time, no matter how long, is not enough to erase the obligation to face the truth. When the verdict had been delivered, and the courtroom doors closed, the lingering question was not what the defendant had done, but why that truth had taken 23 years to be seen. The Laura Bennett case did not drag on due to lack of goodwill, nor because of indifference from the initial investigators. It lasted because a seemingly reasonable decision, made very early, silently shaped the entire direction of the investigation, and obscured other possibilities from the very first days. When looking back at the entire file with the distance of time, the mistake was not in a specific action, but in the way initial assumptions were accepted without being challenged again, when reality brought no results. The first pivotal decision was classifying the case as missing adult, no immediate risk. In 1994, that was a choice fitting the facts at hand: no signs of violence, no crime scene, no threats. But this very classification imposed an invisible priority ceiling, limiting the intensity of the search and how possibilities were evaluated. When a disappearance is deemed to have no immediate danger, all signs tend to be interpreted as harmless, and any detail not fitting that assumption is easily sidelined. The second mistake, and the one with the most lasting impact, was selecting a single most reasonable time point as the main axis for the entire investigation. In the context of needing action, choosing one point to move forward was almost unavoidable. But when that time point was not re-verified after the initial search steps yielded no results, it became an assumed truth. Everything that did not match it, from witness statements to the presence of specific individuals, was deemed irrelevant. The timeline no longer served the investigation. It became a mold that forced the truth to fit. From that flawed timeline, a chain of subsequent decisions was built logically, prioritizing bright and busy routes, eliminating paths deemed unreasonable, narrowing the search scope when no signs of struggle were found. Each step had its own reason, and none could be called careless on its own. But when all were based on the same unverified foundational assumption, the initial deviation was not only preserved, but reinforced with every new decision. The witness statement that Laura stopped to talk to a man was the clearest example of how a reasonable assumption could obscure the truth. That statement was not dismissed for lack of credibility, but because it did not fit the pre-constructed picture. When it was labeled off route, it lost the ability to interact with other facts. Had that statement been kept as a parallel possibility, the critical access point might have been identified far earlier. But in the investigative structure of the time, there was no room for possibilities that would have forced a re-examination of the foundation. Even the discovery of Laura's personal items suffered the same fate. With no signs of violence, it was seen as neutral, and therefore not strong enough to shake existing hypotheses. Only when new technology allowed reanalysis of the evidence did this detail reveal its true value. But by then, more than 2 decades had passed, and the initial decisions had solidified in the file. The Laura Bennett case reveals a chilling truth of criminal investigation. The most dangerous mistake is not a wrong action, but a right assumption held for too long. When an assumption becomes the foundation, all new facts are forced to conform to it, rather than being allowed to challenge it. In this case, the assumption that Laura walked straight home along her familiar route, that there was no immediate danger, and that anything not fitting that image was unimportant, obscured the single moment when the truth could have emerged. The final verdict did not erase 23 years of silence. It did not return time to Laura Bennett, nor allow knowing exactly what happened in her final moments. It only made clear that the truth had always been there, scattered throughout the file, waiting to be re-examined with a different logic. If there is one lesson from this case, it is not a call to perfect investigations, but a warning about the power of seemingly harmless assumptions. This story does not end with relief, nor with a sense of complete justice. It ends with a cold realization: in the world of true crime, time is rarely the one hiding the crime. What truly prolongs the darkness is sometimes just a reasonable decision made too early, and never questioned again. The story of Laura Bennett is not just a cold file resolved belatedly. It directly reflects how society in the United Kingdom today confronts safety, trust, and seemingly reasonable assumptions in everyday life. Laura vanished on an ordinary evening in Middlesbrough in 1994, with no signs of violence, no cries for help, just a moment of stopping to talk to a man that no one found unusual. It was precisely that detail, the brief, polite interaction in a familiar space, that became the overlooked crux for 23 years. The lesson here is not in panic or extreme suspicion, but in recognizing that the most dangerous situations are sometimes disguised by normality. In today's UK context, where cities increasingly emphasize community safety and friendly public spaces, this story reminds us that safety is not just bright lights or crowds. Laura walked the route deemed most reasonable, but the decision to deviate from it, even for a few minutes, took her out of the zone of attention. This raises a practical lesson: trust your personal instincts, especially in seemingly harmless small moments. If a situation makes you hesitate, feel uncomfortable, or deviate from your usual routine, stopping, changing direction, or seeking support is not overreaction, it is self-protection. The story also sends a broader message to modern UK society, where we often believe that, if something were wrong, someone would have seen it. In Laura's case, there was no direct witness, not because no one was around, but because everyone assumed there was nothing to notice. The lesson here is that collective responsibility lies not in forceful intervention, but in attention, being ready to notice, ready to remember, and ready to speak when something does not fit. Ultimately, this story reminds us that safety in modern society does not come only from systems, but from how each individual perceives small moments, for sometimes those moments decide everything. If you believe stories like Laura Bennett need to be retold so we do not forget the cost of seemingly reasonable assumptions, please subscribe to the channel and follow to continue with us looking straight at cases that time has covered over. Thank you for staying until the very end, and see you in the next video, where another file will once again force us to question truth, justice, and the dangerous silences.